Greetings. I'm David Ross. I'll be your Master of Ceremonies here today. Welcome to Dubai and welcome to Mythbusters 2, Revenge of the Cable Myths. Folks, we've got a mountain of magnificent myth-busting for you today, a multitude of masterful myth-busting methodologies. And here to explain it all are master Mythbusters, Alan Malden and Tim Strong. So without further ado, take it away, Tim.
Thanks very much, Dave. Well, what you're going to see today is not a presentation, hopefully, not educational, it's going to be a show. We're here for one reason and one reason only, and that's to entertain you. If you learn something or if this sparks debate or thought, then that's completely inadvertent, so my apologies in advance. What is myth-busting? If any of you have seen the television show Mythbusters, basically they take a commonly held belief, they put it to test by doing some experiments, and then usually there's an explosion or two. There'll be none of that here, hopefully. And then they'll decide, based on their experiments, whether the myth was confirmed, plausible, or busted. And what we're going to do today is go through several myths that we often hear in the industry or things people often say. We're going to start with spying. Are cables more safe if they avoid U.S. territory? Are they free from mass surveillance? A related topic is, has the world, because of the revelations that came out around the time when Edward Snowden leaked all the information, has the internet become less reliant on the U.S.? Have they avoided the U.S. territory? And thirdly, something that's probably on your mind a lot is, do sharks pose the greatest danger to undersea cable infrastructure? Then those are three I'll be going through. Then I'm going to sit down and be quiet for a while. Alan will come up. And he's going to talk whether demand is actually doubling, as you sometimes hear in the submarine cable industry. Secondly, do content providers really need submarine cable fiber pairs everywhere? Some people seem to think that. And then Dave will come up. He was one of the original Mythbusters. Back at the Yokohama SubOptic, he and Alan co-presented this crazy idea that the Atlantic might actually need submarine cables in the next 10 years. And largely speaking, I think they were right. Dave will be presenting what they got right in their projections and what they got wrong. Then back to more myth busting. The global network has never been more resilient. Is that really true? Netflix has giant subsea cable capacity requirements. I'll let Alan explain this one. Energy costs rather than network availability are driving the build decisions for large content data centers. Next to last is the problem of multiple parties trying to build on the same route and having funding problems is something that's unique to our industry. We'll test whether that's true. And finally, I put this at the end because I want everyone to stay. We'll be revisiting a myth from 3 years ago. Okay. So it starts with government interference and ends in vice, essentially, is the way we're going to be doing this today. So first of all, mass surveillance, the myth. If we can avoid the United States, we'll be free of mass surveillance. And we're going to run some experiments and then conclude with and then have a status. Is it going to be busted? Is it going to be confirmed? Well, the concept of mass surveillance isn't anything new. In fact, there's a whole philosophy behind it called panopticism. I didn't know that until recently when I researched this. This thing is called a panopticon, and it was devised by an English philosopher in the 18th century. And the concept is this is a prison or an asylum, and you have a warden who's hidden right in the middle, but it's designed in such a way that he can look into the cells of any inmate. And essentially that's what mass surveillance tools do today. They're a panopticon. But what's different is that the technology has changed. So first of all, let's define how we're going to tackle this. defines surveillance as the observation of an entire or a substantial fraction of the population. So we're not going to be talking about targeted wiretapping. Almost every country does that. But what is sort of new is countries, or the United States, sucking up lots and lots of data somewhat indiscriminately and then targeting. And we're going to be looking both at the optical and IP layer, so I'm counting deep packet inspection as part of mass surveillance. And the approach is simply to take what's been in the press, see what other countries, if any, besides the United States, are engaged in this. And two caveats. One is I'm not going to claim that all countries' capabilities are equal. I'm not saying that the US, the NSA, is on a par with the Belize intelligence agency. And finally, because I'm somewhat intelligent, I'm not going to weigh in here on whether this is a good thing or a bad thing. I think that's a different story. Computing power has allowed for incredible advances. We all kind of knew about a lot of this, but it really came to the forefront 3 years ago with the Snowden revelations. And there are many agencies behind this, but the one that often gets the credit or blame is the NSA. Now, I know Alan and Dave are Americans. Do we have any other Americans in the audience? We have 3 Americans in the audience, that's it? Okay. Well, you know what? They said that we couldn't do it. We couldn't spy on billions of people simultaneously. But with a little Yankee ingenuity and a good old-fashioned elbow grease, we did it. So high five, y'all. Well, Americans get a reputation for being cowboys, but we're not necessarily out there alone. In fact, we have a club, and we call it the Five Eyes Club. One of the founding members is our friendly neighbor to the north, Canada. You probably can't read the small font from this news article, but the Canadians not only share intelligence with the United States, but engage in, apparently, in surveillance of their own. So right now, the myth is already unraveling that if you can perhaps send your hosting to Canada, your data will be safer. If you can reroute your cables around the United States, it's going to be safer. Well, Five Eyes is not just Canada and the US, but 5 organizations. There's Australia this is their little swirly icon is their intelligence agency. And not to be outdone, the Kiwis looking over at their neighbors to the west figure they could have a swirly icon for their intelligence agency just as good. And GCHQ is committed or devised some of the cleverest intelligence coups using mass surveillance that's come to light. And they went with the hip Cool Britannia logo for themselves. Well, it's not just the US and their friends that have engaged in this. In Soviet Russia, porn watches you. There's the emblem for the FSB. In China, Great Firewall, we often think of that as something that is meant to keep out traffic. But in fact, there's deep packet inspection, very good tools there so that they can gauge what people within the country, what kind of traffic they're generating. So it encourages self-censorship. And one point about Russia is that the SORM boxes that they use for inspection, the SORM technology has been shared with most of the CIS partners. So it's Uzbekistan, Ukraine, Kazakhstan, pretty much all the stands have installed this as well. And even some of the NSA critics have gotten involved in this. You heard a lot of criticism in the United States when this first came out from quarters in France and Germany. But just this last year, the French passed a very controversial bill. It was, the Parliament passed a new law, I should say, and it was so controversial that it had to be put forward before their constitutional court where it passed. So if this sounds familiar, stop me, but very much like the United States, the French government obligates providers to collect metadata, and the government has ability to look into the metadata for any sort of strings or data that they want, and then the reviews of that the government is granted access not from regular judges but by a third-party supervisory court. And even Germany, some of the most vocal criticism of U.S. policy has been coming from Germany. This article in Der Spiegel describes how The German intelligence agency got access to several ASs, autonomous systems, not just local directed wiretaps, but entire autonomous systems for providers connecting at DKIX in Frankfurt and several other internet exchanges. This was my favorite article that I saw in this research. This was a leak by GCHQ that Germany was a little grumpy about being left out. Apparently they wanted to catch up. India also in on it too. Not only do they have all the capabilities I described, but there's no oversight of the government there. And as part of the census, Indian citizens, from what I understand, have had to submit some biometric data. But at least they have a really cool logo for their intelligence agency. I like that. So if we're trying to be safe here and avoid the United States, fair enough. Let's see what happens when the US goes dark. Every yellow line here is a cable that's current or planned. Well, that takes out a lot of cables that are compromised. But as we know now, it's not just the US. There goes Canada and Hibernia. Australia and New Zealand also take out CME 3, which has come out that they did gather intelligence on with the help of the Singapore government. England, United Kingdom, not just right around the North Sea, but if you look, a lot of Europe to Asia cables go through there. Then there's Russia and the CIS. France, taking out most of the remaining Europe to Asia cables. India. Bahrain, I didn't mention them, but it's fairly well documented that the government there has very good DPI. China, there goes pretty much all of Asia. I don't know for certain if they intercept at the optical level for submarine cables, but we do know that there's some funny stuff going on. In Germany. So that doesn't leave a lot. And in fact, if you look at this map that was leaked out, it used to be a top secret document, no longer. It was leaked out very beginning of 2013 when The Guardian and Washington Post were releasing the Snowden documents. You can see these circles are what the, I think this is an NSA document, had labeled high-speed optical cable, covert, clandestine, and cooperative large accesses. And it's not just in the countries that I mentioned. There are other countries as well, Djibouti, for example. There are other organizations besides Five Eyes. There's 9 Eyes and 14 Eyes, Italy, Spain. Many other countries are participating. So are you safer for avoiding the US? Maybe. But it's pretty sure that the US is not the only one engaging in mass surveillance. So I think we can safely say that this one's busted. All right, has the internet become more or less reliant on the US since Snowden? We're going to test this a few ways. One is we're going to look at IP connectivity patterns and see if international connections have become less centered on the US, and this is going to be based on telegeography data. What we see here is what was happening to the world right before the Snowden revelations came out. Each line here is showing over time how much of a region's international capacity was connected to the United States. So for example, the top one, the yellow one for Latin America, about 75% in 2012 of all of their international capacity was not connected to each other or to Europe or to Asia, but to the US, highly dependent. You can also see that the line's trending down for most places. Global average had been trending down slightly. Africa had definitely trended down. That's because most of their direct connections were to Europe, that switched to Europe. So if we take what had happened between 2013 and 2012 and projected it out, here's what it would look like. The dotted lines show everything trending down slightly. So if everyone had gotten wise to the United States and avoided it, you'd think that the lines would be above those dotted lines in most cases, right? Here's what actually happened. Latin America has actually become more dependent on the United States than it was before. And in other cases, the lines followed trends. Globally, if we would have projected out in 2012 where we would have been worldwide as dependence on the US, as connectivity to the US, 28% in 2015. And here's where we actually ended up. So above projections. Now you could say that that's just IP layer connectivity, and that tends to mirror what's happening in the transport world. For example, Most of submarine cables in Latin America go north to the United States. They don't go over to Europe or to Asia. So what about end-to-end traffic? Well, that's a lot harder to measure. ISPs tend to lose track of traffic once it exits their network. So what I'm going to present here is just a proxy, and there's some problems with the methodology I don't want to get into, but it's perhaps roughly somewhat helpful as a proxy. First of all, we're going to look at what most websites are the most popular in every country. We looked at, using Alexa, the top 100 websites in 100 countries. And then we ran those URLs through domain name servers in those countries. So if you recall, that's what translates URLs to actual IP addresses. And we did that in each individual country. We didn't want to do it with just one DNS server because, for example, if I did it in the US, it would be more likely to reveal IP addresses in the US. But if you do it in the other country, it's going to be a higher likelihood of revealing IP addresses in those countries. And finally, we took the IP addresses and ran them through a geo lookup. We used GeoLite for this. Probably too small for you to read. Don't want to waste your time, so I'm going to go through this fairly quickly. But again, we ran the top sites. This is for Argentina. It starts with Facebook and Google. It ends at an adult site at the bottom, number 19, 19th most popular one in the country. And then ran those, even more than those, 100 or so, through several DNS servers. These are all ones that are based in Buenos Aires. And as a result, we got a result set of several thousand, I think a couple 100,000 IP addresses. And if you boil it all down, you can see for each country how much of those top websites are hosted in different countries. For Argentina, it appeared that about 49% were hosted in the United States, only 34% are in Argentina, and so forth. So where does that leave us overall? Well, each bar here is showing where the users are, and the color of the bar is showing where those servers for their top websites are. Take a look most closely at the US color of the bar, which is black. Most of the content of the top websites for US users are hosted in the US. Not a big surprise. Europe, a larger amount than what their IP layer connectivity trend showed. Asia Pacific, about half are hosted in the United States. In Latin America, again, it just reflects pretty much what we already saw. Africa, even though only a tiny amount is directly connected, for example, we don't see a lot of Johannesburg to Washington, D.C. Provision circuits. But you do see that over half of the websites that Africans are accessing seem to be hosted in the United States. So what's clear is that they're going up to Europe, peering there or buying transit there, and then having a third party to access that content. So what can we say in summary? Since Snowden, it's pretty clear that globally IP capacity has been less dependent on the US, but no more than we would have predicted through normal trends. And also that user-to-server patterns still definitely center on the US. So this one, I think, is pretty much busted. I think we can say that. Now, if you're a little depressed talking about espionage and the like, let's move on to something else. Talk about animals. I think you all know what the answer to this one is, but it's helpful to review just in case. At Telejarfi, Alan and I still get a lot of press inquiries about sharks eating the internet. So if you recall, a couple of years ago, a news story came out that sharks were biting a Google cable, but Google had wrapped it in Kevlar, so everything was okay. There were many articles that came out about this. One of the first to release information on it was Wired. Sharks wage war on undersea internet cables. And then came Slate that confirmed that the Google internet, or the global internet, is being attacked by sharks. Now, this news agency gave us some hope in our eternal war against the sharks. Even respected institutions, such as The Guardian, got in on this. They laid the blame at sharks and Netflix. The less we say about about Gawker, the better. And finally, this was my personal favorite. Note where the magazine is, Fishing Tackle Retailer. They have a pure clinical interest in this question. You never know where you're going to find your next lure. So based on all this, I decided to do some research of my own, okay? I used Google. I Googled sharks eating fish, and there were 1 million results. Sharks eating seals, 400,000 results. Sharks eating the internet, 1.3 million results. So based on pure logic, this is what we can conclude. So it makes sense to me. Now, I think we all understand that that's not so. Human activity accounts for about 2/3 of cable failures. This is from a paper presented about 4 years ago. There probably is a newer update in the paper session. Now, the other category does include fish bite, and it has been documented as a case of failure in case Elaine Stafford is in here, and she will yell at me if I don't mention that. But it's fairly small. That doesn't mean that I'm not worried. We are constantly vigilant. This story came out a few years ago. Personally, I don't think it's a laughing matter. All right, time for Alan. Thank you.
I'll finish your slides here, Tim. So sharks are the biggest risk. False, it's monkeys. Okay, that's very clear. Now we can go on to the next myth. So, okay, let's get serious now. No more monkeying around. So one of the most common myths that we hear about in the industry is that demand is doubling roughly every 2 years. We covered this myth at the Paris event as well. So in the past 3 years, have things changed? So let's look at this. Is demand for cable capacity still doubling every 2 years? So what does doubling every 2 years mean in annual terms? That's actually just roughly 41% annually, right? So what this chart is showing here is over the past 10 years, the threshold of what it would take for demand to be doubling every 2 years. That's that line there, that's the 41%. So if we look at some data we have on use bandwidth growth for various major undersea cable routes, we can see which are above this threshold. So here we go. So of all the routes shown here, there's been a few years, where the demand did go below the 41% threshold just for a bit. It has then returned. So in the most recent couple of years, you can see really all the routes that are shown here, they are just above that red dashed line, so they are above 41%. So what's interesting about this myth is that, okay, it's been true the past couple of years at least, since we did this the last time, but what if this trend continues? What if we see this roughly 41% going every year in the future? So let's look at what that means in absolute terms. So this is showing what if we take the use bandwidth of each of these routes, multiplied, growing at a 41% annual growth rate every year for the next 10 years. So in the Atlantic, I think it's 2020, we'll be at 200 terabits. A year after that, intra-Asia Transpac, also 200 terabits. The year after that, US to Latin America at the 200 terabits. And from there, it just compounds and compounds and compounds. You get some massive numbers by 2025 here. So what this is really pointing to is something we mentioned today, earlier this morning, is that there's going to be a need to optimize cables to provide ever more capacity through upgrades to current cables, but also we're going to have more cables. And it's going to be something we're going to have on many routes, not just one or two routes. So for the myth of demand doubling, I think we can say that it's demand does seem to be growing by more than 41%. So this myth is confirmed. It is actually does seem to be true, at least for the time being. So here's a new one we wanted to cover this year, the content provider myth. There's many of these kind of folks who are here today, so The myth roughly goes that these guys need to have fiber pairs everywhere to meet their network requirements. So let's see how we can tackle this. So what's the origin of the myth? Well, first of all, I think we're all aware that these kind of companies have become very active in investing in new cables in many parts of the world. Here are some headlines for Google, Microsoft, Facebook, all investing in cables. Our own data shows that these companies' growth across the Atlantic has been extremely rapid. So with this kind of pace of growth, seeing they're investing in cables, it makes sense, right? They need to have their own fiber pairs to meet the demand requirements. And hey, Google, they're everywhere, right? This is a map they showed this today or earlier, which shows their CDN. It's really all over the world, right? So it's global, demand's growing, they need fiber pairs, right? Everywhere. So how can we approach this myth? I have plan A and I have plan B. So my plan A is to ask anybody in the audience, works for one of these companies, to please come up and tell us your network topology, your plans for expansion, everything. BJ?
Plan B.
Yeah. So plan B, I'm going to try to use public information from these companies and see what we can discern about where the network is being deployed and what the growth patterns look like. So what can we find publicly? A paper that Google released a few years ago explains the B4 and B2 network. The B4 is the important one in this context because it's their inter-data center network. And as they have stated publicly, it has more traffic than their B2, which is a public-facing WAN. It also has a higher growth rate. So that's an important clue here, fast-growing growth between data centers. Where is this? This is a little older map, but it shows how they connect across the Pacific heavily, across the Atlantic. So that's where the B4 is. So what about Facebook? I found this image here that shows something about their traffic patterns. And in typical style, there is no label to the axis, either X or Y, so we don't know what this means. But what it kind of shows is that machine to machine, which can roughly be interpreted to mean data center to data center or inter-data data center, is growing at a far faster pace than data center to users. So from this point of view, it seems that they have a similar, somewhat traffic profile to Google here. So this map we've created shows the location of the major data centers for 5 of the largest content providers. The ones that are gray show their planned sites for the end of next year. So heavily focused in the US, Europe, and parts of Asia, and also Australia, and a few in South America. So these are key when we think about what is everywhere. Do they need fiber do they need fiber pairs everywhere, given one of the main goals of their network is to link together these type of facilities? But the picture is more complicated than just data center to data center. It's also the users matter as well. So this map is showing Google's B2 network. The locations are greater than the number of where their data centers are for the B4 network. So you're seeing more locations here. This is Microsoft's network. They showed this map at a conference last fall. You can see perhaps up there the red dots are I believe are the edge nodes, and the blue ones are their data centers. So there's capacity going to locations besides just data centers. It's also going to where they have a large number of users as well. So if we look at just 4 of the content providers here and where they have an edge presence in terms of where they are appearing publicly or privately, we can see in terms of the number of countries per region, how that shakes out. What's interesting is they're not really heavily everywhere yet in terms of where they're appearing publicly and privately. Africa, Latin America, and the Middle East, there's far less coverage for these content providers right now compared to the other regions shown here. And the data that we have gathered on private network deployment shows this trend in a way. There's a lot more capacity for these companies across the Atlantic, Pacific, within Asia, and a greater share of the capacity is attributed to these companies outside of those major corridors where they're trying to link together the major data centers. So for the myth that these guys need fiber pairs everywhere, it seems that they do have heavy requirements that could require fiber pairs on many inner data center routes and to large user bases. But I think it's probably too soon to say they need fiber pairs everywhere yet. But in 3 years, in 6 years, who knows? But for the time being, we're going to say busted for this myth. So hey, it's time for the halftime break. So we're going to ask David Ross to come up here and give a look back at a paper that we did 6 years ago about the transatlantic market. There you go.
Okay, thanks, Alan. You can read the title of this paper. It's about 67 words, and it just shows that at that time, myth-busting was a much more serious enterprise, and we took ourselves a lot more seriously, perhaps. But the reason that we're revisiting this today is that it was perhaps the first myth that we busted, but it was also a myth that we busted with a forecast, and we're in the unique position today of being able to see whether the forecast came true and whether the myth was real or not. So a look back at the perceived problem in 2010. This was a problem that you heard about if you stood around in the hallways or at cocktail parties, at conferences. And it went like this. The combination of high demand and high growth that you saw in the Atlantic would eventually lead to a need for new systems, even though none had been built for quite some time. But on the other hand, the very low capacity prices in the Atlantic, prices that were still dropping, would make it impossible to support a new build. It simply wouldn't be commercially feasible. Now, there was a mitigating factor that continual advances in technology would postpone the day of reckoning, but everybody knew it was coming. And people asked, what are we going to do? Who's going to build these cables? We're going to need them. So Ellen and I said, we know how to fix that. So the way we approached the problem was to model the North Atlantic Basin as a whole, not look at any one cable, but at all the cables in the aggregate, forecast the increase in demand and the decrease in capacity over the next 15 years, the decrease in capacity pricing to see where the revenue would go, forecast the growth and capability of all the existing systems in the aggregate, that is the capability of carrying capacity as it grew, and use that to predict when new systems would be needed. And then to introduce into the analysis a hypothetical new system at the time of the projected need, which of course would be before capacity exhaustion. Calculate the rate of return on such a system under a variety of scenarios and see whether the system was in fact viable given plausible assumptions. And what we found at the time was that a hypothetical new system could be introduced perhaps as early as 2014 that would be financially viable simply by selling a mix of IRU and leased capacity at the prices that we forecast would be in the market at that time, provided that the owners could achieve a 15% market share in the general wholesale market. And there were a number of parties who could potentially pull that off. So we said at that time, seems like this myth is busted. But we went further and we said, let's look and see who might actually do this and under what circumstances. We said someone's going to build these new cables, and among the possibilities that we cited were incumbent owners in the Atlantic Basin who wanted to retain their market share or to grow it, content providers who we knew would be seeking the lowest cost, big carriers who always need capacity, investors, that is, high-frequency traders looking to achieve the lowest latency, or entrepreneurs who wanted all those other folks as customers, and anybody looking for route diversity. And what actually happened, now we know. And within the past couple of years, 2 new cables have been built, and we know there are more coming. And those 2 cables that have been built together encompass just about all of the factors that we said might be involved. An incumbent entrepreneurial owner, a new route focused on low latency, and rumored at least that content providers and major carriers are clients of theirs. New entrepreneurial entrant on a new route, same story. Pretty much nailed it. But we didn't get everything right. The things we did get right, the demand growth remained robust. The technological capability of putting capacity on fibers grew, but not as rapidly as demand. The timing of the new cable builds, approximately right. And the factors that were cited for building those cables, including that the existing cables were filling, there was a need for diverse routing, and a desire for low latency. And the parties that are driving the cables seem to be content providers and entrepreneurs. But what did we miss? Well, there were a couple of important things. One was the advancement of technology. Back then, we really didn't know to what extent the legacy systems would be able to benefit from coherent technology, and it turned out quite a bit. We now have systems in the Atlantic, very old systems that are carrying at 100G or higher. The total capacity in those systems, as we see it today, is about double what we saw 6 years ago. But what we really missed was the market evolution that took place, and we're now in a tale of 2 markets in the Atlantic. A primary market that's given to content providers with their inter-data center traffic that we've heard about in a few talks today. And the primary product in that market is fiber pair. And a secondary market that's everybody else, the general internet, carrier and ISP traffic, IRUs and leases, which is what we thought would be the major market. And as a result of that, the content provider's role in determining what gets built and where and when. And given that, we decided to take a look outward to what would happen if the same trends prevail over the next 6 years or 6 years after that. And this looks out to 2026 in the Atlantic Basin. It's transatlantic purchased capacity by source. The blue area there is the area controlled by content providers. The red area is everybody else. By the time you get out to 2026, the content providers own well over 90% of the market. So, what do we think might happen in the future? Demand's going to continue to grow rapidly, as Tim said. Technological capability is going to continue to grow, but still more slowly than the demand. I think we've heard that in a couple of talks today. And as a result of the demand growth, new capacity is going to be needed at an ever-growing rate. And as a result of the technology growing more slowly than demand, new fiber pair will be needed with an ever-growing frequency to meet that demand. So, is this the market of the future? Is the bifurcated market the new reality? Or is it just today's myth? Well, stay tuned. Next time, we'll see how it turned out.
Thanks, Dave. So let's bust some more myths here. So this is a new one, the diversity myth, which is one I really wanted to talk about, which is the global network has never been more resilient, right? We have reached the maximum amount of cables. We have so many cables everywhere. It's a very diverse and resilient network, right? So how are we going to test that this is true or not? Let's look back in time to 1924. This is an old map of telegraph cables, which I think shows all the cables. I'm not sure, but it seems to show many different companies' cables. Compare that to a current view of the map, and let's see just how diverse we are today versus almost 100 years ago. So Trans-Pacific, hey, we're looking really good now. 11 are in service, 4 more planned versus just 1. So clearly we're doing good now. US to Brazil, there's roughly 3 I was able to count that go between the US and Brazil versus a total of 9, including planned ones there. Hong Kong to Singapore, just 2 cables 100 years ago, 10 plus 2 more planned. We're looking really good now. We are very diverse. India to Southeast Asia, we have a double what we had 100 years ago, plus 2 more planned. Egypt to Europe, it's a little bit closer. There was actually 6 cables 100 years ago on this route, compared to 8 today with 2 more planned. So we're getting a little closer. Now Trans-Tasman, it's interesting, there was 3 cables 100 years ago. There's just 2 today, a few more planned, but in this case, it was more resilient 100 years ago. South America, Africa, there was 3, you can kind of see there's 3 of these cables actually are between South America and Africa, compared to just 1 today, the old Atlantis II cable. There are 2 more planned, but this route was more diverse actually 100 years ago. And the most interesting one of all, actually, the transatlantic. There was 21 cables in 1924 across the Atlantic compared to just 15 today. So sort of funny if we look at the which is the more diverse year for cables by route. There's no clear winner really. It's kind of a bit of a joke here. Obviously, these cables are telegraph cables. They're old. They're all out of service now. But the point is to try to introduce what we're seeing right now, which is a surge of investment in new cables, really on every route around the world. So what this is showing is the investment in new cables for the previous 2 years to what's going to come up in the next three years. So just in the next 2 years alone, I think there's about $6 billion worth of new cables that are going to be entering service. Most of that investment right now is coming into Latin America, but also a large amount across the Pacific as well, and between Europe and Asia as well. So for the myth of how resilient are we today versus the past, it's true. I mean, we probably do have more cables now on many routes than we did before, but let's call this one plausible, just to be a little different here. All right, Netflix myth. This is one we hear about a lot. Netflix has huge subsea capacity requirements. So what's the origin of this myth? Well, if you read a lot of the press, it says that Netflix accounts for a massive amount of end-user demand. So according to Sandvine, who tracks the usage by different applications, it's over a third of traffic in North America, and it's 20% of traffic in Ireland and the UK. And they're expanding rapidly. They're already in 60 countries. They announced plans to enter 130 new countries by the end of this year. So if you look at this, you can see this makes sense. A lot of traffic, it's growing really fast. It's going to take over, a massive amount of the internet, and they're going to have to build their own cables, right? So what does this have to do with undersea cables, actually? What does Netflix have to do with undersea cables? Not too much. The reason I say that is Netflix, in a blog post they published, I guess, 2 months ago, they said they transfer a single copy of a file in their library from the US to a foreign storage location one time during off-peak hours, just once. That one file is then taken and it's copied to other sites in the country, to the various caches, using their OpenConnect, which is their CDN platform. So we look at where OpenConnect is. This is a map from Netflix. It shows at the end of last year, I believe, was when this was, of where they had their OpenConnect caches, right? And the company says OpenConnect delivers 100% of all of their traffic. But let's pause. You have to fill the caches still, right? You have to get the content, all the TV shows, movies that are out there, into the caches in each country, right? Let's do a little experiment. Let's try to take all the data we can find on the size of the library, the file length, the average streaming rate, and see what that means if we were to try to populate a cache of the entire US library of content over the course of 1 month. So let's get started here. A lot of numbers here, be careful. The Netflix library size, almost 45, or over 4,500 movies and over 34,000 TV episodes. That is 39,000 files, roughly. There was no data we could find on how long each file was, but we're gonna assume one hour because it's heavily TV shows, and also one makes the math a lot easier. So we found data that indicates that a user who uses Netflix streaming over the course of 1 hour would consume 4.75 gigabytes of data. So we have our inputs now for our model. So let's see how this works. That means the US library size is 186,903 gigabytes. We have to put that amount of data in a cache in a given month. So that's the library size, 186,903, divided by 30, because we're going to do this over the course of a month. That's 30 days. So we get 6,230 gigabytes. So they said they do this just during non-peak hours, right? So it's not going all day and trying to fill a cache. So just divide it by 12, and then figure out what this means in terms of the bandwidth rate. Anyone care to guess how much it's going to take? Wow, 577 megabits per second. A lot of bandwidth, right? But it isn't even that big because Netflix probably doesn't have to pull in the entire contents of the library each month. Many shows, movies are on there for more than just 1 month at a time. Also, the size of the libraries that are available to different countries, it's a lot smaller than it is in the US. So in the UK, it's half as big. So you would have half as much bandwidth needed to fill the caches. But for fun, let's just look at what it would take if there were no caches. What would it take if we wanted to serve all the subscribers to Netflix in the UK from the US? So there's 4.3 million subscribers for Netflix in the UK at the end of last year. The maximum streaming rate of ISPs, according to Netflix, was 4.03 megabits per second. So if everyone in the UK who has Netflix watched at the same time with the max streaming rate, it would take a lot of bandwidth, 17.3 terabits per second. So the moral of the story is, thank God for caches. So for the myth of Netflix has huge subsidy requirements, we can say that is probably going to be busted. They do have some demand, but not that much. So the last one that I'm going to cover, just a little bit strange. You probably haven't heard this one before, but the destruction of a single satellite would cause half of North America to lose their Facebook. So let's see, what is the origin of this myth? Who has seen the movie Gravity? Anybody? All right, 4 of you, I think. Okay. This movie, we learn that space is dangerous. So in this scene here, a satellite gets blown up by debris flying through space at thousands of miles per second. But never fear, George Clooney comes to the rescue with a little quip. He says, that's what he says. With his typical wit and charm, he says that and goes on to save the day. I was so mad when I heard that, I got up and I left the theater. This is so unrealistic. So let's test this. So what if he was right? What if it was possible that one satellite could serve half of North American Facebook users? So I found the highest capacity satellite in this very good source called the Guinness Book of World Records. Have you heard of it? 140 gigabits per second is the bandwidth for that one satellite. It offers 12 megabits for subscribers. Pretty good, right? So if we assume a 10-to-1 rate of oversubscription, that means that one satellite could serve approximately 120,000 users off Facebook or anything, right? So half of the number of North American daily active users off Facebook is 85 million. So we're going to divide that by 120,000 subscribers per satellite. That's how the math works to figure out what would happen if it were true. If you could destroy, have a satellite serving Facebook users. So what that means is we need 730 satellites. Okay. But it's also important to consider not just the number of satellites, but the cost they would take if this were true. So what would it cost, you think, to have that many satellites? Well, the cost of VSAT-1 is $250 million, which is interesting because it's actually the same as the net worth of George Clooney. It's true, it is. So what this means is that if we were to serve half of Facebook users with satellites, it would cost us $183 billion or 730 George Clooneys. Okay. But seriously, the point of this is to talk about one of the things that you often hear about is satellites versus cables, terrestrial and submarine. But this is data from the FCC that came out last year, which shows the share of circuits, satellite versus terrestrial and submarine that connect to the US. You can see here, satellite, 0.37%. I think we all know that. It's a rather small portion of how the world connects. So for the myth of satellites and Facebook, clearly George Clooney is a very charming man, but he does not know how the internet works. So we're going to call this myth busted. And with that, I will hand it over to Tim to go through a few more myths.
All right, we've got 3 more myths to go. We're going to talk about how energy costs affect the location decisions of data centers. We're going to talk about how cables get funded and the problems with that. And then finally, we're going to conclude with talking about, but not showing, adult content. Energy costs, first of all. It seems like when it comes to the decisions to build data centers, and by that I mean large single-tenant data centers that the kind that content providers are building in sort of weird places of the world where that's not really close to the center of fiber optic connections. It feels a bit to me like a tail wagging the dog. Now, why might that be? Who's in charge here? Well, if you look at the build cost numbers, it's apparent right away what the more expensive of the 2 elements is. Cost of building a 120 megawatt facility, which is a giant facility, admittedly, but this is one that Google announced in the Netherlands. $770 million. Building a transatlantic cable, $250. Very much different. So I think a lot of the content providers are focused first on the data centers and then figuring out how to bring in the network availability to support them. So for the rest of our myth, let's look at what are some of the cost elements driving the build decisions. Electricity is an obvious one. These data centers, especially the kind that the content providers use, pack in lots of servers which use lots of energy. I pulled out from the US Energy Information Administration a huge spreadsheet of prices that various utilities in the United States charge for industrial power rates. Really interesting, I guess, if you're a nerd. And on the west coast of the United States, here's some of the extreme examples. Down in California, PG&E, you're going to have to be paying 14 cents per kilowatt hour. Whereas in the state of Washington, not Washington, D.C. on the East Coast, but the state of Washington, which is in the northwest part of the country, the Grant County public utility charge is only 3.3 cents per kilowatt hour. So I had an idea, a business idea, the 2 steps. First of all, get $1 billion. And that's the easy part. The second part is to take that money and invest it in building a data center. But unfortunately, I'm apparently not the first one to think of this. Looked on Google Maps, and this, the main town, or one of the main towns in Grant County, is a city, or I should say a town called Quincy, Washington. It's this little dusty town in the center of Washington with basically one big street going through it. If you look at Google Maps image, you can see what looks like giant warehouses all around. And what has happened is Microsoft, Yahoo, Intuit, Sabi, Dell, and a few other really big companies have built data centers all around it to take advantage of the very low electricity price. Even a Bitmine coining operation took a 2.5 megawatt facility in Quincy, Washington to save money. And look how much it adds up over time. If you're in a building that's using, on average, over the course of the year, 50 megawatts, this is how much you're saving. You would be paying $60 million down in California. But up in Washington, where you're using this cheap hydropower, which also, by the way, is green and probably gets carbon credits to the companies, you're only going to be paying $15 million. So that's a difference of almost $50 million a year. So clearly, energy is very important, both the cost and the content, or the source of the energy. I've also wondered why content providers have been focusing on Scandinavia or Ireland. Partly it's climate. It's cheaper to run a data center if it's cool outside, less air conditioning. Also, power costs come into play. Here are some of the costs for Sweden versus Germany. You can see right away, I thought Germany would make a more logical location for a big data center. It's closer to the center of Europe, lots of fiber there, but it costs more to power a data center in Germany than Sweden. Look what happens though when you add on electricity tax. Big difference. The taxes come into play, not just electricity taxes, but also sales taxes are very important as part of the decision of where to locate. I know this is not the case in a lot of countries, but in the United States, sales tax and VAT has been essentially devolved to state and local jurisdictions. So they can somewhat compete with each other to offer a really nice deal to some of these big data centers. And because of that, I believe Facebook reported they saved $30 million already due to local tax incentives. Why does sales tax matter? Various reasons, but one is that it takes a lot of equipment to get into, to install into these facilities. So for the energy cost myth, is network availability more important or things like energy? I'd say that there's lots of reasons to locate data centers, energy being a prime one. So I wouldn't say it's necessarily confirmed because there are so many different reasons, but it's definitely plausible. Network availability is way down the list. All right, here's our next to last one, funding. And it's this idea, this sort of concept, we feel sort of sorry for ourselves in the subsea industry. Very often, even now and often in the past, the industry has tried to build on the same path, but multiple parties have tried to do it at the same time. And as a result, there's been a lot of market confusion. We're going to test if that's unique to us, woe is us, or if there are other people who have had this problem. We're actually going to look, first of all, at Hollywood, the entertainment industry. And spoiler alert, this myth's going to be busted. It's this problem of multiple parties or two parties having the same concept at once and pushing out the same product is so common that they actually have a slang term for it called twin films. No, it's not a film about twins. I think you're thinking of Arnold Schwarzenegger and Danny DeVito. This is when movies come out right around the same year about the same subject. Remember these? Dante's Peak and Volcano came out in 1997. Next year, oh, these were some good ones. Well acted. Armageddon and Deep Impact. Same year, 1998, Ed TV and Truman Show. Pretty much the same movie. Also same year for kids, Bugs Life and Ants. Same movie. Movie about talking pigs, 1995. Talking Sharks, 2003. These two movies, Tombstone and White Earp, pretty much the same thing, came out at the same time. I can kind of understand these two. This was the 500th anniversary of Columbus in the New World, but two movies competing at the same time came in then. Braveheart and Rob Roy, Scottish nationalism. These look almost identical. Truman Capote movie. I can't remember if one of these won the Oscar or not, but they came out in the same year. And there was the 1989 Talking Dog, or not Talking Dog, but a dog buddy cop movie. Canine is, I think, the one that makes Dave always cry. He's kind of torn up inside even thinking about it right now. 1986, Iron Eagle and Top Gun, even the logo is the same. And this is nothing new. This has been happening for a long time. 1940, there were two movies about Abe Lincoln's early life. And in fact, it's not limited to just Hollywood. It's so common that social scientists have a term for this, multiple discovery. The guy on the right, I think I'm getting this right, is Isaac Newton. Amongst his many achievements, he discovered or developed calculus. The guy on the left is Leibniz. He did the same thing almost independently in Germany. And then not just calculus. 18th century, this happened with the discovery of oxygen. Mid-19th century, the development of the origin of the species or evolution. It wasn't just Darwin, some other guy pretty much came up with the same idea independently at the same time. It's happened over and over and over again. So social scientists have theorized why that may have happened. And because they're social scientists, of course, they can't agree on it, probably because they can't prove anything. But they have some theories. One is recombinant conceptualization. Now, I'm going to level with you. I don't completely understand what this means. But it's basically the concept that various ideas evolve to a point and then they combine and merge and then a new one develops. And it's essentially that, as opposed to the heroic theory of development, that some genius comes along and reveals to the world what's happened. Instead, it's that the market or science has evolved to a point where it's almost inevitable that these would merge and a new idea would present itself. You could say the same for all these wild transatlantic cable ideas now that are trying to cater to content providers. Content providers are kind of a new thing in the market, so it's not surprising that it wasn't just one person that thought of this. There are several parties scrambling for this. Or another cable right now that's having issues, or cables having issues, the west coast of Australia up to Indonesia. It's been clear for a long time that the market needed that, but several of these cables are competing with each other. A more prosaic reason that multiple discovery is happening is just company to company staff movement, or even better, industrial espionage. Or perhaps people drinking a little bit too much at SubOptic parties and talking. So what does it mean for our industry? One is that there's always market confusion. And the business plans looked at individually for these companies often make a lot of sense. Clear that they're going to make a profit and there's a need for it. But because they're all competing for the same customers, it's difficult to get funding often because they can't meet pre-sale targets. The pre-sales are scattered amongst multiple other parties, and often the customers are held back from committing because they kind of want to see which one is the more likely. And often, if the customers are smart, they'll play these potential sellers off of each other, and the result is price destruction. So it is a problem for our industry, but it's nothing new to us. Think of K9. So this one's busted. And our final myth, and the reason that some of you have made the decision to stay probably, adult traffic. And this is the concept we explored 3 years ago, that adult content drives most internet traffic. Guarantee you that you've heard this myth before, right? And there's never a very good source for it, but I've often seen, 60% of the internet's porn. Well, we're going to see what kind of data there is. Is that really true? And maybe things have changed in 3 years. We kind of busted it at the last SubOptic, but maybe things have changed. How are we going to do this? First of all, we're going to look at a third-party data source. It's the Sandvine that Alan mentioned before. They present some interesting information. What the pie chart here is that we're looking at is peak downstream traffic by different kinds of different applications for North America. And you can see that over 2/3 of that pie is what they categorize real-time entertainment. And that includes audio and video streaming. Really big. Most pornography would be included in that application category. So right now, the myth is looking okay. Looks like it might be confirmed. But we need data on the individual adult sites. Believe it or not, there is an adult content site that publishes detailed information on their traffic. And in 2015, this is the company, and they actually own several other sites that list in the top 1,000 under Alexa. So it's probably the largest site in the world. They revealed that they streamed 75 gigabytes per second, not gigabits, so I presume they're talking about 600 or so gigabits. That's a lot. It's a lot of traffic. But by most estimates of total end user traffic right now, we're at 20 terabytes per second. So it's dwarfed by other content. So that site accounts for about 0.375% of the internet. So if it's not adult content, what is driving all this? Let's focus just now on the real-time entertainment category and see what that might be. Well, there we go. About half is Netflix. Again, this is North America. It's going to be a little smaller in other places. Netflix is a little more prominent, again, at the end user level. This is not internationally, but at the end user level. Then YouTube, Amazon Video, and various other things. The little gray wedge accounts for about 7% of the overall internet. So if we pretended for a moment that that was just adult content, that's still only 7%. And we know that's not the only thing in there. There are things like Spotify and Twitch. Other streaming services are very popular. They're included in that roll-up. So I think we've already busted the concept that pornography is the majority of internet content. But as a slight aside, let's talk about its effect on international patterns. This is a map of the legality of adult content. And I know this is true because I got it off of Wikipedia. Red means it's illegal, and yellow means it's semi-legal or something, some restrictions. And you can see much of the world is red. All of North Africa, pretty much all of the Middle East, red. But if we go back to the Alexa information, which showed the top websites that users are accessing in various countries, we can see that even though it's illegal everywhere, or in many places, it's ubiquitous. On average, North Africa, in North African countries, an adult content website is the 18th most popular site. And remember, that's red, it's illegal there. So it's being served from somewhere, but it's being consumed in North Africa. It's being consumed everywhere. It ranks on down to the US, only 54, and East Asia, the 60th on average most popular site was a porn site. But it is in the top 100 of almost every country that we looked at. If you isolate this on certain routes, so actually let me back up for a moment. What this means is that it's very unlikely to be cached in all these countries because its status is illegal or not certain. So it's probably being mostly served in Western Europe and the United States. I know the site I mentioned earlier uses a CDN that's based in North America and Europe, so it's probably serving from there, and users other parts of the world are accessing it. So relative to a company like Netflix, which tries to push its cache out everywhere, it's probably generating a somewhat higher amount of traffic. And on some routes, I'm not saying it's big. I'm certainly not saying it's a majority, but it may be somewhat sizable. I know that there are several plans to build a cable from, say, Brazil up to Portugal or Spain. Well, using the methodology that I described earlier on, one of the earlier myths, we looked at users in South America and in the websites that were being served to them from Europe. And you can see the top 2 categories, 10 out of the top 20, were adult sites or ad sites that were probably supporting those adult sites. So the myth, adult content drives most internet traffic? No way. It's a very small section of the internet. Perhaps somewhat larger on some parts, some routes of the world, but it's small. This one's definitely busted. I just want to wrap up. If you're feeling kind of sullied by this last conversation, a bit of a palate cleanser, I wanted to share with you some of the research that I did. When I started this, I naturally just started typing in how much of the internet is porn. And here's what came up instead. How much of the internet is IPv6? That makes sense. How much of the internet is cats people are searching for? And the most charming, I thought, how much of the internet is true? People are asking the internet if the internet is true. So we know it's not porn, but we have a few, so I think this busted. We have a few minutes, I think, left for questions. While you're thinking of your questions, I just want to show you some videos of what the internet actually is comprised of. So just take a moment to gather your thoughts. Okay. So to sum up, where do we stand with all the myths that we've tested today? 1, cables that avoid U.S. territory are free for mass surveillance. I think that's busted. Internet providers around the world have become less reliant on the U.S. due to Snowden. Also, that's pretty certainly busted. Sharks pose the greatest danger to our cables, busted. However, demand for capacity is growing, is doubling every year, confirmed, according to Alan. Content providers right now need fiber pairs everywhere you can think. Right now, that one's busted. Global network has never been more resilient. That's plausible. But we bust the concept that Netflix needs huge capacity requirements everywhere. And finally, according to George Clooney, the destruction of a single satellite would cause us to lose our Facebook. He's a freaking idiot. Energy costs are driving build decisions of data centers. Plausible. The problem of multiple discovery in our industry is unique to us. Not true. And adult content is a majority of the internet. Also busted. So that's where we stand on our myths. I think we've got about five or so minutes, so I'm going to hand this over to Dave. And if any of you have some easy questions for us to answer, please ask them.
Okay, questions?
Oh, no.
Yeah. Julian?
Thank you. Julian Rawle. First of all, congratulations. Fantastic presentation. Must have taken an awful lot of work to put all that together. 2 comments. On the resiliency myth, I would suggest that we are much, much more dependent on the internet as a global economy than the telegraph system, than when we had the telegraph system. So I think there's more to that equation than was actually presented today, and you might want to take that away and think about it a bit more. The other thing I wanted to suggest for the next time round, because you must do this again, it's fantastic, is something that has bothered me ever since I've been in the industry is that, well, when I came in, we were at 2.5 gig. And there were technologists telling us then that we can't challenge the laws of physics and it just can't be done. And now we're at 100 and 400's coming and 1 terabit after that. So, you know, when you're talking about the technology curve not staying ahead of the demand curve, I think we have to rethink that because the historic trend shows that we keep beating it.
Well, be sure to take that one up. I've got an answer for that already. Okay, any others? Yeah, down here.
Thanks. Doug Widori from Dine. So, Tim, in your analysis looking at the location of content, so we've done some similar analysis to that, maybe you're aware of. I think you answered the question of how dominant is the United States or how reliant is the globe on the United States for content, and for sure, as your analysis shows, it is heavily reliant presently. But I think if you were to look at that year after year over time, you'd find evidence of content moving out to the edge, and the end result is a more resilient internet that if people do lose international links, there is local content that they can draw on, where only a few years ago that wasn't the case.
Yeah, I don't have a timeline. I thought about doing the work to do it. That was from last, the data I presented was from last April, and I haven't had a chance to redo it using the exact same methodology to test, but I plan to do that. There are a lot of caveats also to that data set. The problem of anycasting makes things really confusing. You get a single IP address for Facebook. It looks like it's in the US. It's probably being served more locally, so it's exaggerating the US centricity of the network. But I thought it was still relevant to what we're still seeing is that, shoot, the US still is pretty much at the center.
Is that it? Down here?
Yeah.
This is really not a question, but a comment/story. So your notes about monkeys in India and sharks underwater snipping at cables brings up an interesting story of another type of animal. So this was about 3 years ago. So Valley and I, we were pulled into doing some deep debugging. The symptom was that we had a certain route. Every 3 or 4 weeks, we had a problem where we had intermittent failures. So we had, like, say, 1 second of bit errors, and we just could not diagnose it. And there was no optical power hit, etc. And then we went into like full throttle, so we put a deep polarization mode, and we thought it was a polarization related issues. And we, Valley looked up some of the physics books, and we just couldn't figure it out. And then we waited for a couple of months, still couldn't figure it out. And since it was happening once every 3 or 4 weeks, it was extraordinarily difficult to debug it. So finally, we like moved traffic off that route and got another route, etc., etc. And the next year, the problem continued for some more time. And then one day, the traffic completely stopped. So we had just a test channel running on it, and the traffic completely stopped. And now we were able to truly debug it, because now the traffic is gone, and then went to the specific location. And it turned out that it was actually a squirrel that was nibbling at the fiber. And we had a location where there was a transition from an underground cable to an aerial cable. And all the things that we looked at, so when the storms came, we thought it was the storms, but it turned out that the storms were actually driving out the squirrels, and when the storm came, the cable was very clean. And later it turned out that it was correlated to the mating season, and when the mating season happens, the squirrels like to nibble on fibers, and that was what it finally came down to. So. And these were flying squirrels, so.
Thank you very much, folks. It's been great.
Nice job.